The Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy has brought us together today to listen to Doug Bandow and have a conversation about the impact of war on the economy, which has become a global issue for us, and it's been known for many years that it's of a primary issue for the United States and a primary issue for our allies and our friends worldwide. Doug has spoken and written for many years on deconfliction and on global power. And we're very glad to welcome him here today. It'll be a presentation followed by a period of questions and answers, and we look forward very much to hearing him. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I thank you. I appreciate the invitation to speak. As you know, this certainly is a good time to discuss this issue. We have not only issues of the budget going on, but multiple wars. Indeed, frankly, we've been at war for most of the last 20 years, kind of an extraordinary period of time. I also have some pleasure in being in this building. The Cato Institute was actually headquartered here 25, 30 years ago. This conference center was not constructed then, but it's kind of a pleasure to come back and see what has happened since then. But if you look at the issue of war, the issue of the economy, I think it's important to recognize that our founders had a lot to say about that. This is not really a new topic, but actually this is a rather old one. That the Republicans, the small r Republicans in many ways, were especially against standing armies. You had kind of early debates, very strong ones, involving Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, and others in terms of what kind of a military policy. Even these the hardcore Republicans at times had to temper their principles. Thomas Jefferson in office is the man who established West Point, for example, to create a professional officer corps for the Army, and realized going into kind of naval conflicts that the U.S. actually had to have a navy. But since then, I think we've all agreed that we have to have at least some military. The challenge, of course, is what kind of a military, what to use it for, what kind of a standard to use it for. There was a time where people looked at military, I think, and viewed it as a unique instrument, one that one would employ as a last resort, one would employ only where there were truly significant, even vital interests at stake. Today, it's become just another public policy. It's kind of epitomized by that wonderful exchange between Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell, which is recorded in Colin Powell's diary, or his autobiography, where Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, kind of wants to wander around the world doing good, says to him, what's the value of having this great military you keep talking about if we never use it? And of course, so she's of the kind of, you have sanctions, you can have diplomacy, or you can have military, it's all the same. The next line in his biography was, I almost had an aneurysm. Because, of course, Colin Powell had served in Vietnam, saw men who died, had to deal with families who had lost loved ones. He understood that the military is something unique, that this is not something one just kind of dismisses out there, that military personnel are not gambit pawns in some global chess game, but something actually very valuable for their own society. And I think that the only way one can make intelligent decisions about when to use the military is to recognize the costs and benefits of military action. We certainly have folks who, in recent years, seem to have believed that military is cheap. The famous cakewalk that Iraq was supposed to be. That, in fact, you're likely to act very differently if you understand the costs that are involved. Today, we seem to have lost that. But again, the founders recognized it. James Madison had one of my favorite quotes. He said, of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most dreadful because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debt and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instrument for bringing the many under the domination of the few. So he perceived that this goes back. This is more than just one policy, but in fact it has extraordinary impact. At the Constitutional Convention, when there was a debate over war powers, who could actually send the U.S. to war, founders made it very clear that they didn't want any one person to be able to do that, to put us, as one of them said, James Wilson, in fact, talked about involving us in such distress. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, warned that if you gave this power to a president, that they were likely to promote America's destruction. They saw, the war power as something extraordinarily powerful. Indeed, even Alexander Hamilton, that great proponent of executive power, assured the people at the convention, the delegates, that the power of the president would be nothing like that of the king. The king can go off to war. That power is given to Congress. Trying to kind of assure people, don't worry, this is going to be a bounded power. So it's certainly worth looking at the costs of war, that there are multiple costs that are out there. My focus today, of course, is economic costs. And I think that there are many there. You look at the military budget, you look at the impact on the economy, the impact of the national security state on our economy, the potential use of conscription, casualties both at home and abroad, the uncertainty that's created in international relations, the extraordinary unintended consequences. Almost all of these wars seem to give us revolutions, insurgencies, terrorism, and more, the danger to the homeland. I think all told, if you look at the costs of war, they certainly bear out Randolph Bourne, who warned us a century ago that war is the health of the state. I've always been struck by conservative friends of mine who say they believe in limited constitutional government and to be supporting a more militaristic policy because, of course, war is the ultimate big government program. War is the consumption of resources, of taxes, the taking over of civilian life, the destruction of liberty. That doesn't mean it's never necessary, but it certainly warns us that this is something we should want to keep bounded. And I think the potential that comes into this in American society today, I think what is extraordinary is the question of rent seeking. The government we have today obviously looks rather different from the government that we had 250 years ago. But one of my, I think the favorite episodes, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Well, at that time in Milwaukee, the 5th Annual Defense Contracting Workshop was meeting. And co-chairman Jim Roberts opened the proceedings, saying, "Thank you, Saddam Hussein." And the audience cheered. Because this gave us the opportunity now to have the bigger military that, of course, he and the industries represented wanted. Bill Niskanen, the former chairman of the Cato Institute, reported at the time, he was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for Ronald Reagan. He heard, was talking with someone who was very hawkish, whose comment to Bill was, "We owe Saddam Hussein a favor. He saved us from the peace dividend." Saved us from the peace dividend. In Military Technology magazine ran an editorial that said, "Well done, Saddam," was the title. And the publisher noted that villains like Saddam have a very useful function. They give us a justification for a bigger military, quote, "without the need for too much propaganda effort by our governments." So I think this is always a backdrop when we start thinking about military action. And I'm not one to believe that everything that is done in the government is a result of special interests. I don't believe that Dick Cheney wanted the Iraq War because he thought it would enrich his shares of Halliburton. Nevertheless, we certainly should recognize in this city that interests matter and that we've created a system that unfortunately seems to lean towards more military action. Now, in talking about the economic costs, I want to emphasize that the human costs are hideous. So to talk about the economic cost is not to ignore those. One, think of the lost lives, our lost liberties, the destruction of societies, the impact on human happiness. All of these are very good reasons to be concerned about war and the costs of war. But economics is another one that's certainly worth looking at all the costs together. But the first is the military budget. I like to tell people that military spending is the price of your foreign policy. The worst thing you can do is to decide you want, do everything and slash away at the budget. You're going to get people killed. If you want to have an expansive foreign policy, it will be expensive. There's no way around it. So folks on Capitol Hill who want to imagine that we can have a cheap military budget without actually changing our foreign policy have got it exactly wrong. We have to talk about what we want to do in the world. If we want to dominate the world, run the world, fix failed states, protect rich allies and everything else, we got to spend the money. It's why we have carrier groups. It's why we have everything else in our arsenal. Of course, in the big wars, the costs are extraordinary. World War I and especially World War II. But even in peacetime, the amount of money that we spend is extraordinary. We're spending $717 billion this year. The president now apparently is asking for another $50 billion for next year. He stepped back from that moment, very short, that tiny moment, where he suddenly decided maybe we were spending a little too much and gave in. But what's extraordinary is you take the numbers. I mean, I tell conservatives this and they don't like to believe it. What's very useful is to go out and look at the real spending levels, that is adjusted for inflation. And what you find, there are a lot of numbers the budget office uses, so it gets kind of complex, DOD, security overall, et cetera. But taking the DOD number, they give us $650 billion this year, which doesn't have some of the costs that aren't in DOD. During the Vietnam War, the cost of the DOD peaked at $608 billion. During the Cold War, that is the Korean War, it peaked at 536 in real terms. During Ronald Reagan's buildup, it peaked at 593 billion. It is only exceeded by the Bush years of the Bush wars. In 2010, it hit 767 billion. So we are spending more today than we did during the Cold War, or the Vietnam War, or Ronald Reagan's buildup during the Cold War. It's extraordinary. So to have people tell us that it's being starved, today, without a Soviet Union, without a Korean War, without a Vietnam War, without Maoist China, it turns out that we are extraordinarily at risk. We had a recent commission that just put out its report and told us that indeed America is in danger of losing a war. I was trying to figure out against whom. It's hard for me to imagine the Iranian invasion that's going to conquer America, or I don't know, the Venezuelans may launch the pincer attack through Central America or something. Quite extraordinary. And of course, the question is, what do we use all this money for? Excuse me. Agencies like the GAO say that it's impossible, to actually do an audit of the Pentagon. I mean, a number of years ago, Congress ordered that all agencies have financial statements, and the Pentagon for years didn't even try. They recently, made an effort at an audit, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense said, "We failed the audit, but we never expected to pass it." So, right? So what's the problem? Why worry? Of course, the tragedy is if you actually look and see what we spend the money for, it's hard to be very happy about that. The war on terror, however you want to call that, but basically Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, all that stuff. The Brown University has the Watson Institute that's looked at the costs of war. Their estimate is that we have spent on the war on terror so far about $5.9 trillion. It's an extraordinary amount of money, $5.9 trillion. And you think, on what? What have we gotten out of that? Great, successful democracy in Libya, wonderful functioning state in Iraq. This is amazing. And what you find is that includes everything. It includes not only expenditures on the war, it includes the cost of caring for veterans and a number of other things. But what they tell us is that if we don't change anything, by 2023, we'll add another $800 billion to that total. We'll be up to $6.7 trillion. It just keeps going. And really that's the problem, is that if you look ahead in the years ahead and what the Pentagon wants, we will have both a high base plus the high contingency, that is the ongoing military operations. There is no presumption that that will end, that this will continue again and again. And it's always important to emphasize percentage of GDP isn't particularly relevant here. I always love, I hear folks say, well, the military doesn't really cost anything, because we once spent, actually 1940s during the war, we peaked at 37.8% of GDP during World War II. See, and today we only spend 3.5% or something. But the point is, the U.S. economy is far larger in real terms. The U.S. economy today is about 10 times as large as it was in the late 1940s. That means spending 3.5% of GDP today on the military is actually devoting the same amount of resources as we did during World War II. The only question is, for what? Certainly the dangers are different. Now, things are more expensive today. All that's true. But it's important to realize the problem here is not that the military is underfunded. There is a mismatch in terms of what's being done. What is it supposed to do versus the assets that it has, but that doesn't mean there are too few assets. It's a question of what it's supposed to do. You have to look at both sides of that. So that's one set of costs, is if you want to be the policeman, you're going to spend a lot of money. The second are kind of restraint and diversions from the economy. In total war, that's almost complete. The whole kind of alphabet soup set of agencies, back during the 1940s, rationing, all of these things, clearly a free economy doesn't operate in those circumstances. But even in our own, there's a lot of data out there, and I won't bore you with it all. But clearly, spending money on weapons creates jobs. I mean, that's what the president tells us. All that wonderful Saudi money that's going to come in and build things and all the jobs that are going to be created. Of course, the difference in having money spent on weapons versus other things is that other things normally also provide some benefit for what they are. I mean, if I build housing, there's an expenditure paying people for the houses, but the houses actually help people. There's some social benefit that comes out of that. The best news on the bombs is they're never used. Right? The second best is we have to use them, but they do their job. But there's no additional benefit there. So if you're choosing where to spend your money, the least economically effective spending is going to be on the military. It's just the reality. That it's first best to be spent in the private sector, but secondarily, if you want to spur the economy, other sorts of spending is going to be better for that purpose. And lots of studies, they've looked, for example, at how many jobs are created through military spending. Basically, military spending creates some. Healthcare, clean energy, tax cuts, a number of these create about 1.5 times as many. Educational spending is at least estimated by economists to create twice as much. So if you want these other things, you should spend directly for it. It's the same thing with technological development. No doubt, there are technologies and advancements that come through military spending, but if you actually want those, it's far better to spend directly. You don't hope for some indirect benefit to come when you're building bombs, but instead you go after that, directly. That overall, the problem with this is that military spending brings a whole bunch of stuff along with it typically. It contributes to the deficit, higher interest rates, more interest spending. A number of things happen over the long term, that are not economically beneficial. So we should not look at military spending as somehow an answer to economic problems. And for the president to imagine that the jobs benefits of this kind of thing is worth the kind of pirouettes that he's tried taking on and dealing with Saudi Arabia, I think shows a lack of understanding of that issue. There certainly are other impacts, national security state restrictions. Many of these are heavily directed at technology. Some of that is access. It's a question in terms of sales. It's restrictions on information, impacts on liberties. There's a lot of that stuff out there. The reality is, the moment you get into security and military issues, you're going to be creating a national security state. It doesn't stop just at the Pentagon. It kind of radiates outward. And these kinds of restrictions, think encryption. Australia just passed very strong legislation trying to break encryption, allowing the government to basically break secrecy of private individuals. All of these overall are going to have impacts on investment, technology development, product use, commercial sales, and ultimately economic growth. Now, some controls undoubtedly are necessary, and I think issues like China provide us with some very difficult issues. What technologies do we want to allow to be sold to China? What are the dangers of them being used against us? Not all of these issues are simple. What's critical is to realize the costs involved. The worst thing to do is wander out there thinking it's all free. It's not. Almost all of these issues require trade-offs, and the trade-offs are very significant. The possibility of conscription is another issue. We had conscription during the big wars. We had 16 million men served in the military during World War II. The vast majority were either conscripted or volunteered with kind of imminence of conscription. Conscription was the mechanism by which we took a whole cohort of young people out. And we haven't had it since it ended in 1973, but there have been times people have suggested it again. And one of the times pressure was during the Bush years, because it turns out people weren't that thrilled about serving in Iraq, especially reservists who found themselves sent in multiple tours, losing their jobs and everything, where they were supposed to be emergency supplements, and they found that they were actually common substitutes for active duty. And there was some discussion at the time whether one would have to move towards conscription. Certainly government likes it in the sense that it cuts costs. It's actually an issue where professional military officers tend not to like it, because if you want to have a motivated force, you much prefer to have people who want to be there as opposed to people you've dragooned in. And there are a lot of costs for the military and the government of conscription, enforcement activities, invasion activities, all sorts of things. But it's certainly a complete attack on a free economy. That you think about that kind of management by the state, extraordinarily intrusive. Set aside the whole issue of individual liberties. Extraordinarily intrusive when it comes to economic issues. And if we're going to forever garrison bastions around the world and remake failed societies, we may very well find that comes a time where young men and women really aren't very interested in joining the services. And then the question is, what happens? Are we prepared to back away, or will we move forward and say we've got to drag people in? Another area of costs, casualties. And this again, there's the human cost here to me is paramount, but there's also an economic cost. That when you look at kind of dead over the years, I mean, we had 116,000 dead in World War I, 200,000 wounded. World War II had 400,000 dead, 670,000 wounded. Korea, 36,500 dead, 92,000 wounded. Vietnam was about 60,000 dead, 153,000 wounded. I mean, the good news with both Afghanistan and Iraq is fewer soldiers die today. In part, we have a lot better medical care, but we still have a lot of wounded. Afghanistan, casualties about 2,200 dead, 20,000 wounded. Iraq, about 4,500 dead, 32,000 wounded. Plus, local troops, about 110,000 died. Contractors, who tend to be left out of these numbers, but people who are working for the U.S. government, 8,000 contractors have died in both of those U.S. contractors have died in both of those conflicts, 1,500 allied personnel. These are extraordinarily important human costs. And if one wants to see what the casualties, what the wounded go through, the CRS put out a guide, Guide to the U.S. Military Casualty Statistics. It makes for very sad reading. I mean, they have tables about loss of major limbs. I mean, you're just, oh boy. I mean, this is the reality out there. Again, this is not cost-free. These are not gambit pawns to be sacrificed. And that obviously has not only a human cost, but a very significant economic cost. Part of that is caring for those who've been wounded. Disability payments, health care payments. So far, about $350 billion. Over the long term, the estimates are there'll probably be at least another $1 billion spent. We will peak at about 4.3 million veterans in the coming years. And that will hold relatively steady for a good long time. And there's obviously also an economic loss, a loss of productive people, creative people who could be in the workforce, who could be contributing to the economy. There's also foreign casualties. Of course, foreign casualties are very often left out, but they're certainly part of the human equation. We supposedly are doing good things, and what we find is we cause extraordinary chaos, disaster, in those countries. In Iraq, I mean, we really don't know how many people died as a result of the war. There are a number of different estimates out there. The Iraq Body Count, which is a group that basically took reported deaths, so the death had to actually be reported officially, came up with about 200,000. Now, their view was that probably should be doubled. I mean, lots of people get killed in this kind of conflict. Nobody ever reports it. I mean, you think of the kind of sectarian strife that was going on, the murders of Shia and Sunnis and everything. So if you double it, it's 400,000. And there were estimates out there using methodologies people argued about that took the numbers up to about 1 million. But even if you take the 400,000 number, that's an extraordinary number of civilians. Now, America didn't kill them, but we blew up the country. We just tore it all up. And lo and behold, sectarian war enveloped the place. The cost of that, absolutely extraordinary. In Afghanistan, it's been less. 31,000, we think, around that, civilian deaths. I mean, of course, there's also local troops. And I mean, you can even talk about the combatants on the other side, tens of thousands more. And this has costs of its own. Part of that is requiring aid and reconstruction. These countries are for the very long time going to be much poorer, much more vulnerable. It makes them much less successful economically, even if they can survive the conflict. That the Institute for Spending Reform pointed out that military interventions in the past have almost always included a humanitarian support element, paying for sanctuaries and buffer zones for refugees, displaced people, establishing safe zones, protecting them, other humanitarian efforts. I mean, the moment you step into conflict, as Colin Powell once said, the Pottery Barn rule, which I'm told is not really the Pottery Barn rule, but it's often used. The notion is we broke it, we own it. You show up and you start blowing up these societies, it's very hard to walk away from it. You're going to have more costs coming. There's also cost that comes from the international uncertainty and hostility created. It's hard to look at the Middle East today and say that it is better than it was in 2003. More stable, more secure, whatnot. I mean, mass conflict all over. Indeed, one of the great achievements of the Bush administration was not only to blow up Iraq, to unleash the Shia majority, to create out of that al-Qaeda in Iraq that morphed into ISIS. But it was also to empower Iran, who we are told is this terrible, awful, horrible beast that's about to consume the Middle East and presumably us. And of course, this all came out of the fact that we got rid of the one, kind of potential containing country. And people are surprised. People seem shocked that, in fact, a Shia majority government in Iraq might have close relations with a Shia majority government in Iran. Shocking. I mean, who would imagine, such a thing? That extraordinary to think what's come out of that. And I don't think we're going to see the end of that anytime soon. You see, I mean, we're certainly seeing what we're going through with Saudi Arabia. I mean, even our supposedly wonderful ally here, we've suddenly realized that maybe they aren't the friendliest folks around. That one looks at the Yemen war, whether we'll be able to end U.S. support or not, who knows? I mean, you look at these conflicts, the U.S. has helped trigger a series of wars that have been utterly disastrous. And that kind of chaos, has an impact economically as well, in terms of trade, investment, in terms of, uncertainty at home. I mean, a lot of these issues, it plays into an international economic environment, that raises very important issues. Along with that, of course, it's the question of kind of unintended consequences, many of which are even greater. I mean, I think you look at war, and almost always you seem to set loose conquest, revolution, insurgency, and terrorism. I mean, you just look at major wars that we fought and what they've done. Rarely do these wars end, everybody goes back to the way they were. Almost always there's something new, and very often that's a very bad new. I mean, the Franco-Prussian War, most Americans don't pay much attention to that, but that gave another revolution in France throughout the new imperial order, brought in a very different order, a very revanchist and nationalistic one. World War I, of course, basically blew up everything. It took down the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and German empires. It blew apart the Balkans, destroyed the Ottoman Empire. Everything. It gave us fascism, Nazism, and communism. Wow, that was a really great, successful war. Fantastic results. I mean, World War II, the outgrowth of that, there was conquest. You could look at kind of the Soviet Union moving forward, revolution, insurgency, places like Greece and Yugoslavia. I mean, again, what it unleashed was extraordinary. And even Iraq. And again, you look at what's happened in neighboring countries, happened to the country, Iraq itself, Libya that we were involved in, etc. That, what you find is extraordinary results. And terrorism is part of that. Of course, terrorism cannot be justified, but we should have no illusions. I mean, terrorism doesn't happen to us because we're so wonderfully sweet and have a First Amendment. Terrorism is a tool. It's a poor man's weapon in war. If you don't have interballistic missiles and you don't have carrier groups, terrorism may be the thing you've got to go for. It's not new. It's not like Americans are the first people hit with this. A couple of czars of the great Russia, were murdered over this. World War I was triggered by, really it looked like state terrorism, a Serbian-supported attack on the Archduke, the heir apparent of Austro-Hungary. You look at a country like Sri Lanka. I mean, until Iraq, Sri Lanka had the most suicide bombers. This was a fight between Tamils and Sinhalese. It had nothing to do with the kind of conflicts that we've been involved in. That what you find is this becomes yet another weapon of war. And unfortunately for the United States, that weapon of war has come to the homeland. The U.S., so for a very long time, I think, enjoyed the perception that war happened to other people. In World War II, the attack on the American homeland was Pearl Harbor, plus some balloon bombs the Japanese sent that exploded here or there in the Pacific Northwest. That was it. And some saboteurs showed up and didn't last very long. Not much happened there. That was America's, the homeland under attack in World War II, compared to Europe that was utterly ravaged by war. Look at World War I, the same thing. The U.S. sent troops over. It was France that bore that extraordinary damage from the trench warfare campaign. I mean, all these other countries had enormous damage, enormous casualties. And for the U.S., the war was over there. I think 9/11 suddenly brought home to us that wars don't always stay over there. I mean, if we manage to get ourselves into a war with China or Russia, the war certainly won't be staying over there. It could get very ugly. That, nevertheless, even if we don't go with them, that terrorism and other things can come to bear. So the American homeland is not exempt. I do have to say, one of my favorite characters here in town is Lindsey Graham. his comment, about Korea, he urged President Trump. He said, President Trump, if we don't get denuclearization, President Trump, he's going to attack North Korea. And yeah, it'd be kind of bad, for the Koreans and the Japanese. I'm serious. This is what he said. He said it on TV. You can get the transcript if you want it. He said, yeah, it'd be kind of bad for the Koreans and Japanese, but at least the war would be, quote, over there, unquote. The war would not be, quote, over here, unquote, which, of course, made my South Korean friends feel very good. The problem with that, of course, is there are about 250,000 Americans in South Korea every day, and we would be involved in the war that ensued, and the North Koreans might very well be able to have, depending on their capabilities, maybe could hit Guam, could hit Okinawa, and others that have significant U.S. forces. Nevertheless, I think it's important to realize that the U.S. cannot expect to be invulnerable in the future. To go into war assuming that it cannot be over here is a very huge mistake. So if you put all this together, I think it tells us the cost of war is very, very high. Much of that, as I indicated at the start, it's not economic, it's humanitarian, it's liberty. A whole host of issues that are extraordinarily important. But also you throw the economic on top, this is no cakewalk. And basically we are broke. The United States has about $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities today. That is promises made, particularly Social Security, Medicare, for which no money is in the coffers. There is no funding provided. It's promises with nothing behind them. The question then is, how do we pay for that? Last year, the Republicans, the party of fiscal responsibility, simultaneously increased spending and cut taxes, giving us a deficit of over $700 billion a year. This year, that deficit will be about $1 trillion. It is going to increase unless something changes, that is, Congress suddenly becomes responsible, It will hit about $1.5 trillion by 2028. Over the next decade, we're talking about another $12 trillion in red ink. So the question is, how can a republic that's bankrupt fund the kind of foreign policy that we have today? And I think the real challenge, and I think this is where I'll close, is that we need a military. It is a dangerous world. Nevertheless, how we use that military is up to us. What the tasks that we give that military is up to us. There is no more fundamental duty for the federal government than the common defense, as the Constitution puts it. But the Constitution is imagining the common defense of America, not everybody else. The question is does it make sense to spend the kind of money that we do, which is almost entirely on power projection, not deterring attack? What other country is going to attack us? Who is going to successfully attack us? Very hard to imagine. The challenge for us is, are we prepared and can we attack China if we don't like what they're doing over Taiwan? Or can we attack Russia if we don't like what they are doing over Ukraine? That is a much more expensive, much more problematic endeavor. And the real question, of course, comes in if the Germans and the French and the Italians and the Spanish don't want to spend money on their defense, why exactly are we doing it for them? We live in a world that's very different from 1945. The good news is circumstances have changed. Our foreign policy should change as well. It's time that we take into account the extraordinary costs economically and otherwise, for a policy that has become far adrift from one that is genuinely committed to the defense of the United States. The sooner we act, the sooner we can get our finances in shape, and also we can save lives and save liberties of the American people as well. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
My question is, could you talk a little bit more about the current military activities in Yemen and how you think the interests of the United States differ from the interests of other players in that war?
Look, Yemen is an incredible tragedy. At some level, I would say in terms of national interest, geopolitics, geostrategy, Yemen is not an interest of America. The question is, what happens in Yemen that is of great relevance to the national security of America? It's very hard to figure that out. Right now it's a humanitarian tragedy. It's hard to see, to my mind, a great security issue. It's important to recognize that Yemen is a country that's been in conflict since the very beginning. Basically getting independence, it's complicated, it came out of Britain, and we started out with a couple of Yemens. But if you go back 60 years, we've had kind of a history filled with conflict between the two Yemens. At one point, the Saudis were supporting the royalists, who I think were the north, and the Egyptians were supporting the socialists, who I think were the south. So, I mean, it cost, the Egyptians lost tens of thousands of soldiers. It's one reason why they did not answer Saudi Arabia's call to put troops in this go-around. They'd been there. They'd done that, and they really didn't want to repeat. Even when they reunited, which I think was back in the 1990s, you had a lot of strife within. I mean, the irony is the current conflict came out of the fact, I mean, Saleh was our guy for a very long time. Not a very nice guy, fairly typical of rulers of that part of the world, but he was our guy. And then he got ousted after kind of the Arab Spring. Hadi comes in. So what happens is Saleh now then works with the Houthis, who had actually revolted against Saleh, right? So they just come together now to take on Hadi. But this is all internal Yemenis politics. Trying to decide who, I mean, none of these players are people I'd want to invite to my dinner party. I mean, and certainly proving that is the fact that Houthi mob killed Saleh after they had a falling out. I mean, these are not people to trifle with. But I don't see, I mean, the question is, how on earth can the United States care about this? Other than this humanitarian sense, beyond that, how does any of this matter greatly? The biggest problem there is we have an al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, which is viewed as probably the most effective, the franchises, if you want to call them that. But of course, it's been helped by this war because, number one, the Houthis were anti-AQAP, and now they're busy doing other things. And it turns out the Saudis and the Emiratis both have helped radicals to varying degrees. Hadi's government, in fact, has worked with them. So, I mean, this is, the bad guys from our standpoint are actually doing better because of the conflict. And I mean, the Saudis wanted to have their guy in Sana'a. Again, this is hardly unusual around the world, but they really can't blame. The Iranians' influence has always been very limited. I mean, the Houthis and the Iranians have a rather different. They're Shias, but they're different degrees. And when the Zaydis, the Houthis are different. I mean, it's all complicated and well beyond the details that I ever want to learn. But they're not as if they're. I mean, every regional specialist will say they're not proxies of the Iranians. But since they've been attacked by the Saudis, they've looked for support, and the Iranians have found a nice way to bleed the Saudis. It doesn't take an awful lot of weapons to shoot down some airplanes of the Saudis, and frankly, the Saudi military isn't very good. It's a prestige force. I mean, it spends $80 billion a year on the military. Not clear they get a lot of quality out of that. So I think that we got into this, as far as I can tell, only because the Obama administration wanted to prove to the Saudis that despite the Iran deal, we still love them. And the way we proved to the Saudis we still love them was to help them kill Yemenis who'd never done anything against us. I found that appalling at the time. It's even more appalling today. So to me, the only issue, military, strategic issue for the United States in Yemen today, I think, two, one of which is AQAP, Al-Qaeda, and the second is your relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. To what extent do you view those as important allies, and this is part of that allied relationship? I don't see any independent security reason why the U.S. should be involved, and certainly not involved in military. I mean, today, I guess we stopped refueling. We suddenly found out we actually underbilled them. We weren't even getting all the money we were supposed to in charging them. But we still provide them with munitions and intelligence assistance. And Yemenis are aware of who's been helping the Saudis kill them. I mean, the bombs fall, and the ones that don't explode, they can see where they were made. I mean, Yemenis are not stupid, and unfortunately, we've made a lot of new enemies, out of this process for no good reason.
I was just wondering what you think about potential solutions to halting the MIC. I think oftentimes people like my boss, people maybe more on the right, think that you empower Congress to assert their power against the executive, and that's how we're going to stop the wars. I think people on the left tend to assume quite the opposite. You get a political messiah in there, like a Barack Obama, and he'll bring in the utopia, though clearly that didn't happen. I heard you say quite early in your talk that one of the dangers of the warfare state is maybe one day we'll get tired of war and people just won't want to go. That sounds great to me. I think my solution, which I don't know why nobody talks about, would be to reinstate the draft, because I wouldn't go. I think a great many people wouldn't go, and I don't think anybody's having any conversations about transgender bathrooms anymore as soon as our kids start getting drafted for war. I think we would reprioritize what we care about, correctly so, and focus all of our attention there if people started getting drafted and going to war. But anyways, what do you think about a potential solution? Why not a draft?
Well, you look at the Vietnam, the draft went on for a very long time. The draft is a wonderful machine to churn out soldiers. It took a very long time to try to use that opposition to push it to high levels and actually have an impact on voting. I mean, for a very long time, parents of those who would be drafted typically supported the war. I mean, you look at numbers in terms of support for the war. But to me, the problem with the draft is that, okay, I need another 50,000 soldiers. Well, call them up. And the other thing is that we assume the draft means that rich kids go out and fight. It doesn't. I mean, the point is, who goes to combat arms is a very different question. Who becomes the company clerk? Who becomes, there's a great exchange where Pete McCloskey, who's a congressman, a liberal Republican from the Bay Area back when I was in Stanford Law School, and he told a story when Pat Robertson was running for president. Apparently they were on a troop ship together, and Robertson told his mates on the ship he wasn't going to be in any fighting because his father happened to be a U.S. senator. And as I remember, he ended up getting shipped back. Now, Robertson denied it after it was done, but that was one of those where McCloskey was actually in favor of national service and stuff. But McCloskey had fought. I mean, McCloskey had been out there and is a serious guy. I mean, I think the problem here is that to assume that a draft would create the opposition is just very unlikely. To me, the best thing about a volunteer military is you can say no. And that was the problem for the Bush administration, was they were finding it tougher. Then it's a question of, do you accept lower quality? Do you pay more? And it never got to the point where it would cut off support. But there certainly is that possibility. Imagine 10 years from now when all we are still doing are kind of patrolling third world states that we want to remake. It might be a lot harder to find people go in. And I think the worst thing to do would be to have a draft. Over the long term, maybe it would energize people. But Americans tend to be pretty oblivious to international issues, so it would really have to come home. I mean, it's the casualties, I think, that energize people. I mean, one thing, of course, is to the extent you can energize Congress and convince it not to be cowards, they could have an impact. Right now, Congress loves the current situation. The president takes us to war, and Congress can applaud if it goes well, and it carps if it goes badly. But you want to ask them to take responsibility? Are you nuts? Oh my goodness, what a terrible thing. They might be held responsible by the voters because of that. That'd be awful. I mean, what we need we have a few members there who constantly try to hold them to account and say, and we need that. And we need Congress, we need legislators who are serious about their constitutional role, whatever they think about war. And second, we need legislators who don't think these are just games to play over there to show how tough they are, but are serious issues. And look, we should try to find people to support for candidates who might change things. And to me, that's the frustration with Trump, many frustrations with Trump. I mean, I never had any illusions, but you look at some of the things he said and you think, wow, he got that one right. Well, he's the only one who says that. I mean, Hillary Clinton would never say that. And of course, he surrounds himself with people who don't believe anything that he's ever said. I mean, John Bolton, a national security advisor? I mean, President Trump told us he didn't want anybody working for him who supported the Iraq War. Even today, John defends the Iraq War. And he never has enough wars. He wrote articles he wanted to attack Iran and attack North Korea. He wants to keep us real busy. Never mind, Iraq and Libya and everybody else. And he's running national. You don't put your hope in princes, but I do think you keep working for them. So the big thing, I think, is you've got to energize people, and that's hard. Americans have jobs and lots of stuff on their mind, and they're not really impacted dramatically by other countries. And unless somebody they know dies, it's pretty hard to get them interested in Yemen. And the people dying in Yemen are Yemenis. I mean, the irony of Saudi Arabia is, estimates are something like 60,000 civilians have died there. No reaction kind of across America. Jamal Khashoggi, who I knew, I had lunch with him, I've been on panels with him. But he, a Washington Post columnist, well known among the elite in Washington, he's murdered, everything erupts. There's a face. It's an old Stalin, dictum. A million people is a statistic, one person's a tragedy. We suddenly have a face. And that face is known by people who matter in Washington. As that helped transform, and that has really helped us leverage on Yemen. I mean, the irony is that single death may actually get us further on Yemen than thousands and thousands of Yemenis being slaughtered, millions of people being undernourished, cholera epidemic. I mean, everything that's going on, nobody pays attention. One guy gets killed and suddenly off we go. So and we have to use those opportunities, find them when they come and use them as much as we can.
Hi, I wanted to flip it around and ask about the effect of the economy on the war. And that is, we've got a $20 trillion debt. We've got an annual deficit that's about $1 trillion this fiscal year, the one we're living in right now. And at some point, the American people and the representatives in Congress are going to have to get serious about deficits and debt. They'll be forced to by the bond market. And when that happens, what will the impact be on our national security complex? Once you start, changing the policies for Medicare and Social Security and domestic things that matter to people here, at what point will there be some sort of interest in looking at what we're doing around the world?
Oh, I think it's inevitable. I mean, supporters of an ever bigger defense budget like to say that, well, this isn't driving the debt. It's all those silly social programs that are driving the debt. And that's true. The problem, of course, is people value those silly social programs. And they probably value them more than helping the Germans, and the Germans want to spend 1.2% of GDP on the military. Look, the problem we have now, and it just gets worse, everybody likes to go after domestic discretionary spending. That's the go-to place. It's easy to control. It's 15% of the budget. So the problem is if you want to control spending, essentially we have $1 trillion deficit. Now, if you got rid of all domestic discretionary spending, we'd still have a deficit. It doesn't solve it. And we're not going to close down the Washington Monument and fire all the Hill staffers and everything else that comes out of domestic discretionary. It won't happen. So where else does the money come from? It's interest. Indeed, the CBO tells us that in another 10 years, we could be spending $800 billion a year on interest. That comes off the top. Now, you can control interest only by repudiating the national debt. Now, that would be fun. It would have lots of interesting consequences. Probably won't happen. Okay, so you can't do anything directly about interest. Well, then what do you have? Well, you have Social Security, which is the big program, eventually gets passed by Medicare, but currently the big program. Age dependent, as people live long, the proportion of the population is older and people live even longer, that goes up. Okay. Second is Medicare, and that's even worse because it has the age component plus health care typically increases faster spending than everything else. And Medicaid, the poor person, we don't spend as much money with them, but it's still expensive. Okay. What do we cut? Well, my reaction is go out to assisted living homes and explain to people why the U.S. really has to help the Europeans, those poor people, and why it's extraordinarily important that we rebuild Libya. And the poor South Koreans, my God, how could they take care of themselves with only 50 times the GDP of North Korea? Oh, that'd be so terrible. And can you imagine if the Japanese had to spend more on their military? The world would end. Go make that comment at the assisted living facilities, and my guess is the result isn't going to be very what you want. So I think we're going to be driven to that. What scares me is we will be driven on the spending side and not the foreign policy side, which means we will drive down military spending out of necessity without rethinking the foreign policy. And then I'm afraid people get killed, and but I think it's going to happen. So that's why I tell people, think about foreign policy today. This is coming. Far better you prepare for it, do it right, otherwise it's going to be forced on you. The CBO, their estimates are, that by like 2038, we could have, 148%, debt will be 148% of GDP. The top the U.S. ever had was 106% in 1946. Greece was at 143% before everything blew up. And you saw there the violent social breakdown, et cetera. And they run it out. The numbers like 2 decades later, if you don't change anything, get up to over 200% of GDP. I can't believe these numbers. At some point it has to fall apart, but it could be very ugly.
Kimberly Dvorak. I actually have 2 questions. First, I wanted to find out if you included in your war spending numbers the TBI and PTS expenditures that the RAND Corporation did a study on that are well over $1 trillion that's going to cost the U.S. government, U.S. taxpayer. Is that included in your numbers?
Well, estimates are included for them. I don't know. This comes out of the Brown University, the Watson Institute, and they include VA, disability, a whole host of those, but I don't have the breakdown, who's have come in there.
Okay, and then my second question kind of piggybacks here with the solution. Has Cato Institute, have other think tanks come up with some actual solutions that can prompt military leaders, the president, and Americans that, maybe we should focus our spending in this country and retool our war machine like we did after World War II? Anybody thinking about that or talking about that? Because it doesn't seem like we're getting a lot of solutions. And I think that if we have solutions, we can make a better argument.
Well, since its founding in 1977, my institute has argued against military adventurism and argued for cutting military spending. And we focus on the question of commitments. We argue you've got to start with foreign policy, which is why if you don't have to defend your allies now, don't do it. If you don't have to create new conflicts, don't do it. So we've been arguing that without extraordinary success, I might add, but we have certainly been trying. And there are others out there doing the same. It's tough. This is a city in which there's a real investment in the status quo by a lot of people and a lot of interests, and it's not easy to break.
My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation, Japan native, U.S. citizen. I am still concerned about North Korea, Korean Peninsula in general, because I don't believe that North Korea is going to give up their nuclear weapons. I don't think they'll ever give up. So that's a concern. That's number one. Number two, can you talk about South China Sea? I'm talking about China, the rising power. It's a great concern. So those two things. Maybe number three, maybe you can expand nuclear. The future war would be from space, maybe. So can you talk about that?
Well, I have no doubt. Space could easily become, another, kind of, field of war. Who knows what weapons we'll have and what will go up. I mean, if the possibilities are there, people will use them if they can. That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I don't believe North Korea will give up its nukes either. I think the most important thing is to realize from an American standpoint, North Korean nukes don't matter. I mean, North Korea is not going to attack America. The reason North Korea threatens the U.S. is because we're over there. I mean, from a North Korean standpoint, they'd prefer to be ignored by America. If we're going to threaten them, the question is how do they deter us? I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, this is a wretched regime, extraordinarily poor. Its conventional forces aren't very good, antiquated weapons, etc. It could wreak a lot of havoc on South Korea, especially Seoul, in a war probably. But beyond that, I mean, So the point is, they're not really a threat to the U.S. It's a question of them threatening, particularly South Korea, maybe Japan. I mean, a little bit beyond. So then the question is, so there's no conventional need for America to be there at all. Then the question is, what do you do? Assume North Korea moves ahead with nuclear weapons. I mean, you could decide you want to keep an American nuclear umbrella. It really has nothing to do with conventional forces. Or the second is you could suggest, within hearing of the Chinese, that if the North Koreans are going to proceed ahead with proliferation, maybe we shouldn't bother ourselves if the South Koreans and Japanese, and who knows, maybe even the Taiwanese and Australians decide they want nukes. Because my guess is that the moment the Chinese hear Tokyo and nuclear weapons in the same sentence, they'd go nutso, and they might decide that maybe they should do a little bit more to try to prevent their buddies in Pyongyang from moving ahead. I mean, no one wants North Korea to have nuclear weapons. The thing is, why should the United States get in the middle of that kind of a situation? The question is, are there better alternatives? A number of years ago, the challenge was issued by a Chinese general to an American official saying, you won't risk Los Angeles for Taipei. And that is the challenge, which is, are we prepared to risk nuclear war over what are frankly peripheral security issues for us? Even if there's humanitarian and other things that are real. I mean, Taiwan's a great friend, Japan, South Korea. Are you prepared to fight a nuclear war? So these are areas I think we need to actually have some serious discussions. I'm not convinced I want further proliferation, but I also don't really want the U.S. in the middle of a nuclear exchange. So I think these are things we need to work on. And I'm hope we should proceed with North Korea, because I could imagine a North Korea becoming kind of, in a sense, a less dangerous nuclear power, in the sense that we look at in India or in Israel or something. Because it looks to me like, I think Kim wants, I think he actually likes the international diplomacy game, and I think he wants economic development. So I do think there are things there that he wants. I don't think he'll give up nukes for a lot of reasons, but he can very well make some changes and give up some and other stuff that might make the situation a lot less dangerous. We should proceed on that. Well, the challenge of the South China Sea is, number one, the U.S. has no territorial interest there. So then the question is, to what extent are you prepared to get involved against a relatively aggressive or assertive China, which views its moment after centuries of humiliation to come back? And are you prepared to lend your navy to other countries? I mean, the Philippines wants to protect Scarborough Reef. The Filipino flagship is an American cast-off Coast Guard cutter. I mean, that's the Philippines Navy. So they want to go, if they want to go, ship to ship with China over naval questions, they actually need to have something. It's very dangerous to say, oh yeah, we'll back you up, because, oh yeah, great, now what? What's going to happen? And I'm glad to see that Japan is slowly, kind of tortuously, but kind of making some changes in that. Like Philippines now wants, Japan involved. India's involved. I think that's very good. India's involved with Vietnam and elsewhere. Vietnam's building things, Singapore. So I'd like to see a balance of power emerge. We want to be far away from that. You might give some assistance to friends in what they develop, but we don't want to be the on-site people trying to arbitrate in terms of very difficult territorial disputes.
What actually gives you hope here? I know we've got action in the Senate and the House today on the War Powers Resolution, and could that potentially keep allowing us to fix our foreign policy, force a conversation, but on top of that, what else gives you hope?
Well, I do think we have some leaders on both sides and both parties who are serious about these issues. That's critical. This can't be just one partisan side. It has to be both. It has to be seen as something that's not just directed at the president or at something else, but instead as a broader. I think that's useful. I do think that, part of it, I think there's a revival in certain ways of the left on the war issues. They didn't really want to criticize Obama very much. I mean, the anti-war protests seemed to die away when Bush left office, and we're fighting, we're twice increasing troops in Afghanistan, and we're going into Libya, and et cetera, and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what? Hey, guys, and no. So I think it's come back, but you also see, Kelly is back, Vlahos is back there with the American Conservative. I mean, we have conservatives, people on the right, who are fighting a very good war against Republicans and conservatives on these issues, willing to say tough things. So I do think that I hope is enduring. I hope that we've seen the necessity of that. I think the Yemen situation is hopeful. It's kind of ironic because I think much of it comes out of Khashoggi. There was a base there of people who were frustrated, 44 votes last year, et cetera. But I think that we have more oomph there. And I think it's hard. I think the president and Pompeo, you talk about an awful op-ed, and you read this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and you just have to run screaming from the room, thinking that the Secretary of State is putting his name to this. And to have the things the president said, such a tin ear on these issues, and I think that has been helpful. To some degree, my reaction here is that we just don't know the future. Things can change very dramatically, very quickly in circumstances, and if not us, who? If not now, when? And I think that we really have that burden. It's frustrating, and we can't be certain of any results, but I think you step back and you say, but could I remain silent when these things are going on? And I look at the Yemen, I'm just constantly appalled to think my nation is doing this. It's outrageous. And well beyond, there are other conflicts I could, I don't think we should have been involved in Libya, but I think it was kind of a different order thing, et cetera. This is one that just so grabs me, and I think it's grabbed a number of other people, and that's hopeful.
I wonder if you could talk a little more about a point you mentioned about the international economic consequences of conflict. And in particular, is there any serious scholarly work out there trying to actually estimate the costs of things like instability, threats of war, or even something like increased oil prices caused by instability in the Middle East as a result of the invasion of Iraq? Thanks.
I haven't seen any good numbers. It's pretty hard to do. You can certainly track oil prices. You can look at things like the insurance cost of vessels. Say when the Iran-Iraq war was going on, and the question of Gulf traffic and attacks being made. But there are fairly limited things you can measure. And you start thinking about broad, what does instability mean? Presumably it has an impact on investment decisions in America. Or that is, American companies thinking about investing overseas. Do I invest? And what do I invest in? And if I don't think energy sources over there are secure, do I do something different here at home as opposed to an oil base? All that's probable, but how do you come up with anything that is even a reasonable proxy? It's really tough. And I'd love to see some on that. It strikes me you're really struggling. It's in some sense it's got to be there, but I don't know how to measure that sort of thing. Certainly oil prices are an easy one we see go up, but even there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And exactly how much are the Saudis pumping, and what are we betting that how much will the Iranians be able to sell kind of outside sanctions? A lot of these things, even there's stuff going on. We may not know exactly, where that is. It's having the influence. All we do is see some public events. I wish there were some good numbers. That would be very useful because it'd be nice to add that on to realize there's a global impact here too. It's not just one country or another, but in fact, everyone's affected by that kind of stuff.